Dear friends, welcome to the session on land alienation, displacement and forced migration. My name is Dr. Gadadhar Mahapatra. This session has 4 objectives. First, to understand the main cause of land alienation in India. Second, to develop an insights about development-induced displacement and problems of rehabilitation and resettlement among tribal communities. Third, to examine the factors leading to forced migration in tribal areas, and finally to provide a critical appraisal of mining-induced displacement and resettlement through a case study. The key themes and issues to be covered in this session are such as land and social hierarchy, draft national tribal policy, right to land, Land Acquisition Act 1894, eminent domain versus public purpose, Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act 2013, Forest Right Act 2006, Tribal Land Alienation, Process of Involuntary Displacement, Forced Migration for Economic Survival, and a case study on Vedanta Almina, Kalahandi district, Odisha. Finally, conclusion and policy implications. To begin with, land is not merely an economic asset, its ownership is socially valued and sought and denied. In rural societies, ownership of land is coterminous with social status. However, its unequal distribution reflects both prevailing social stratification and also helps in maintaining the hierarchical structure of the society. Pattern of land ownership shows that while large owners invariably belong to upper caste, the cultivators belonging to the middle caste, and agricultural workers largely belong to Dalits and tribal communities. Over 80% of the scheduled tribe population works in the primary sector, with 45% of them being cultivators and 37% being agricultural laborers. Land thus represents the most important source of livelihood, emotional attachment, and social stability in tribal communities. The draft national tribal policy testifies to it and notes that alienation of a tribal land is the single most cause of pauperization of tribals and rendering their vulnerable economic situation more precarious. Despite the constitutional provisions and the special policies and programs adopted by the state for the welfare of the tribal people, the conditions of the tribals continues to be deplorable. Land, the life support system for tribals, continues to be passed from tribes to the non-tribes through such means such as fraudulent transfer, forcible eviction, mortgages, leases and encroachment, despite legislation restricting the alienation of land from tribes to non-tribes. As per the information available with Ministry of Rural Development in January 1999, 4,65,000 cases of alienation of tribal land covering an area of 9,17,000 acres were registered in 11 states in the country. Displacement is the other important factor accounting for the loss of control and ownership over land and forest by tribals. Displacement has occurred primarily because of large-scale projects like industries, irrigation, and hydroelectric projects and mining. This has resulted in the displacement of a total of 21.3 million people in the period between 1951 to 90 in the states like Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan and Odisha. Of this number, 8.54 million, that constitutes 40%, were tribals. The large-scale alienation of land from tribes to non-tribes and the massive displacement of tribal people largely explain why the percentage of tribal cultivators have declined from 68.15% in 1961 to 54.5% in 1991. 42.9% of the operational holdings of tribes belongs to the category of marginal farmers, which means they had hold less than 1 hectare of land. Civil society groups and activists have pointed out the manner in which the application of the Indian Forest Act 1927 and the Land Acquisition Act 1894 have caused marginalization and hardship to the Adivasis. The Wildlife Protection Act 1972 and the Forest Conservation Act 1980, the Tree Prevention Act and the Forest Policy 1988 also affected tribal people. However, the Forest Right Act 2006 is an important act it has begun the process of recognizing the rights of the tribals, and it will be the legal basis for computation of a compensation in case of a diversion of a forest for development projects. With the enactment of a Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act 2013, comprehensive resettlement has been legally mandated and people affected by the project have been included. Now coming to the question on tribal land alienation. Alienation of land of tribal communities and loss of common property resources, mainly forest and large scale displacement and enforced migration, takes place in several ways. Development induced displacement by acquisition of land by the state based on the principle called eminent domain for public purpose without a land for land provision for rehabilitation. Acquisition by the state for development projects also leads to alienation of land and displacement due to environmental pollution and damage to the land in the area near projects, but tribal peoples who displaced are not entitled to any compensation. Illegal land alienation takes place in several ways. This is due to participation of revenue functionaries and officials and incorrect interpretation of laws, manipulation of records and permission accorded to the alienated land. State laws are amended to include provisions that facilitate land alienation of tribal communities. Community land of tribal communities is recorded as government land in survey and settlement operations, and most state tenancy laws recognize only individually owned registered land. Such lands have not been fully surveyed and there is no record of user practices which would be shown as government land. State action of acquiring tribal lands for settling refugees has also resulted in land alienation and displacement. Creation of national parks has resulted in alienation of rights and consequent displacement and forced migration of tribal people. Conflicts in the northeast have resulted in tribal people losing everything and being displaced from their homeland. Now coming to the question on involuntary displacement. Displacement is a process in which marginalized sections, the majority of being tribal people, are pushed out of their own habitat and disposed of their resources and indeed their universe around them. In post-independence period, their experience of a displacement is dehumanizing as before independence. Mineral and hydroelectric resource rich states of India tend to be the very place which are home to vast majority of tribal people. The unrestricted power of the state has led to acquire private owned land without any obligation on the state to rehabilitate persons affected. It has resulted in large number of cases of inadequate compensation, forcible acquisition, loss of livelihood without preparation of resettlement sites, and restriction in access to forest and other common property resources, and loss of community ties, cultural land and religious heritage. In the case of displaced people, their unfamiliarity with money market has led to devastating consequences. All this has led to abject and chronic impoverishment of the displaced people. Public authorities and private corporations alike have either sought to or succeeded in acquiring land, forest and other common property resources from marginalized groups by giving meager compensation. The displaced persons and project affected persons who were better organized and articulated have been able to get benefits of the resettlement and rehabilitation much better as compared to those who were not organized by NGOs or civil society organizations and who could not articulate their grievances have ended up being pauperized. Now coming to the question on forced migration for economic survival, tribal people suffer predominantly from the phenomenon of poverty-induced migration on account of rent-fed agriculture and absence of other avenues of employment. Fragmentation of land, loss of land due to acquisition and illegal land alienation by non-tribals also cause people to migrate. Deforestation and decreasing access to forest and drought are other contributory factors for tribal migration. Due to compulsion involved in migrating in search of a livelihood, it would be more appropriate to describe such migration as forced migration. Here is a case study on mining induced displacement. from Kalahandi district, Odisha, in which the Vedanta Alumina Corporation affected more than 1453 Dongoria tribes who were displaced from their mainland. To sum up what has been discussed so far, land alienation is not mere a structuralist legalist phenomenon, rather it is related to the existing socio-economic order. Land alienation gradually leads to depeasantization of tribals and hence violates their basic right to life. The dynamics of a tribal land problem is related with ownership pattern in adjoining districts. The relationship of non-tribals with the tribals is not a symbiosis, rather a kind of parasitism. Increasing industrialization in the tribal belt have led to impoverishment, displacement and alienation and violation of rights of the tribal people. Unscrupulous forest policy has led to pauperization and violent unrest among the tribal population. Decentralized development process involving voluntary agencies at the grassroots level have made the tribal increasingly aware of their rights and privileges. With this, I come to an end of the session on land alienation, displacement and migration and leave you with few questions which you will find easy. Further, a link to a documentary on Gaon Chhadav Nai, We Will Not Leave Our Village, is shared here which you will find interesting. Thanks for watching this video.